Jesus said in John 8:32, he said, then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So the question is, what's the truth? Because here's the reality. Our beliefs, in other words, what we hold to be true, drives our behaviors. So what do you believe to be true about white people, about black people, Hispanic, Asian, Indian? What have you chosen to believe? Because it is driving your actions. You know, when we look at scripture, the Apostle Paul tells us something in Romans chapter 12, verse 2. He says, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. And what Paul is saying, he's saying, don't conform. Don't just be like everybody else. We don't need to give in to the value system of our culture or our society. And so Paul is saying, don't be pressed into that worldly mold any longer. He says, but be transformed. And that little Greek word is where we get the word metamorphosis. You might be familiar like with when a caterpillar turns into a butterfly. He's talking about being transformed. He's saying at the end of the day, I want the outcomes of your life to be different than the outcomes of most of the people you're gonna bump into. It's okay to want some of the same things. But as far as outcomes in your marriage or with your children, finances, the way you approach life, your career, your relationships, and also how you view and treat people, in other words, your thinking, your beliefs should be different than the world. You should be transformed. But the question is how? And here's the secret. He says, by the renewing of your mind. Now, this is so powerful because the Apostle Paul 2,000 years ago says, the only way you're going to have a transformed life, the only way that you're going to love, this is the way we would say it, love and live like Jesus, is to transform your thinking. You've got to renew your mind. And this word renew could also be translated renovate. Paul's saying that we need to renovate our minds. Now, let me ask you a question. How many of you have ever renovated a room or maybe renovated a house? And if you have, you know it gets incredibly messy. I mean, there's no such thing as a non-messy renovation. Even after you clean it all up, when the workers go home for the day, there's still sheetrock dust and tape and maybe nails and plastic everywhere. It's just always messy. And in the midst of renovating, you probably always ask the question, at least I do, why am I doing this? Is it worth all this trouble? I had a perfectly usable kitchen and now I can't even go in there. And we ask the question, is it worth it? You know, another thing that I've learned about renovations is it always seems to take longer than you expect. My wife tells me, I think I can get it done in a couple weeks. I kind of go ahead and start planning. It's probably gonna take a month because renovations are not only messy, but they always seem to take longer than you expect. And when the Apostle Paul is saying this, he's saying, as you begin this process of renewing your mind, as you renovate your belief system, you have to take out the old stuff, the stuff that isn't true, the lies that you've believed, maybe the myths, the stereotypes that maybe you've bought into, and you have to replace them with the new, the truth. See, renewing your mind, renovating your thinking is replacing the lies with truth. Because when you know the truth, Jesus says, the truth will set you free. I want you to look at how this verse finishes, and this is so huge. It says, then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. And this is so important because this is what the verse means. As you begin to see life as God sees it, as you begin to see people as God sees people, then you'll begin to do as God says. When you really believe what God says, then you'll begin to do what God says to do. See, our Heavenly Father cares deeply about each and every one of us. And he wants us to see things the way that he sees things. He wants us to learn to think as he thinks, because the way that you view the world will impact the decisions that you make, which ultimately determine the outcomes in your life. So here's a big question that you need to ask yourself in any or every area of your life. Here it is. What are the deeply held beliefs that lead me to the decisions that I make? Now just think about it. In marriage, what was I thinking that led me to believe that I should marry this person or move in with this person? You say, I knew better. But see, there was a strong belief system that you gave into to make your decision. Think about your finances. What was I thinking that led me to believe that I could acquire that much debt? Just think about it with your self-esteem or your self-respect. What was I thinking that led me to believe that it was okay to allow him or her to treat me that way? But see, now I want you to ask that same question in the context of people that don't look like you or don't look like me. What are the deeply held beliefs that lead me to, you fill in the blank, the decisions that I make? What is it? Do you clench your purse when you see a person of color? Why would you bring up the rap sheet of George Floyd instead of just grieving over the fact that someone's being mistreated? If you voted for President Trump, does that make you a racist? See, I've heard all these things. These are real questions that we have to wrestle through and work through. Do you know why this is such a critical question? Here's why. Because renovating your thinking first starts with taking out the old stuff before you can put in the new stuff. Just listen to what Paul says in Colossians chapter 3. He says, but now you must rid yourselves, in other words, put away, cast off all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Don't lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self. There is that taken off part. He says, taken off with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being, look at this, renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Now here's what he's saying in this passage. You can't live the way you used to live because you're not the person you used to be. So your thinking, your belief system has to change. See, when you become a Christian, God started the messy renovation project in us. You gained a whole new identity. Your old identity was taken off, and he gave you a new one. And he says, remember, this takes time. And in the first century, the baptismal ceremony illustrated this well. The person being baptized would walk up wearing his old clothes, and they would take those off as they entered into the water to be baptized. And then when they came out, they would put on new clothes. The old clothes representing the old life, and the new clothes representing the new life. So since we have put on the new self, becoming a Christian, if you will, look at verse 10. He says, we are being renewed in knowledge. In knowledge. It's your thinking. He's saying you are a brand new person because of what Jesus has done for you through the cross. He says he declares you and I righteous. He declares you holy. But your brain has not caught up with your brand new identity yet, which is why we struggle. Which is why we have to renew our thinking by taking off the old stuff and putting on the new truths and beliefs of God's word. And maybe you're wondering, why is this so important? Here's why. Because when we believe things that are not true, it negatively impacts our attitudes and our behaviors. See, you and I live in a society that specializes in marketing misinformation about God, about sex, about relationships, about money, and about the people that don't look like us. And see, the misinformation has been passed on from generation to generation to generation, and we've bought into some of these lies. And so this morning, as we continue in our series, I want to again explain why we're talking about this subject, why we've called it the gospel and race. Here's why. Because we're a disciple-making church, and I believe this is a discipleship issue. And I believe we have to educate ourselves to understand what's true, both biblically and socially. And so this morning, I've invited a friend of mine, Dr. Tyron Tanner. He's well accomplished. He's written more than 30 books and articles addressing race-related issues, closing achievement gaps in education, best practices in parenting. He's shared his research in countless U.S. venues in more than 20 different countries. And over the last 25 years, he's served in multiple positions, including professor and researcher, school personnel director, high school, middle school administrator, and teacher, just to name a few. But currently, he's serving as the executive director of Prairie View A&M University, Northwest Houston Center, and the professor of education. And he's a part of the Sci Life Church, he and his wife and his family. And so I am greatly honored that he would take the time to spend with us to be able to have this conversation on the gospel and race.
Well, I'm glad that you joined us this morning. And as I mentioned, super excited to have Dr. Tyron. And we're one of the things that I think is important to understand is I think this morning has the potential to be very enlightening, very helpful, or maybe for some of you, it could be very frustrating. And I think for every single one of us to not shy away from that, but to really engage. And here's one of the things that I would throw out to you. My hope is that the posture of our hearts would really be set in such a way that we would really seek to understand, not get defensive. Nobody's making accusations. It's just really trying to understand and process and think through how we think, how we respond, how we react, what we really believe. Because as I mentioned, what belief drives behavior. And so Dr. Tanner and I, we've been talking about, this getting together, spending some time. We talked in the foyer numerous Sundays. We talk at men's fraternity on Wednesday mornings. And, I'd say kind of unfortunately, this kind of said, man, we need to sit down and talk. And so I reached out to you and just said, listen, I really want to have a better understanding. And you've been incredibly gracious to not just only be a friend, but really just really help me get my head around some things that I was personally just wrestling with, and then also thinking about what does this look like for our church. And so, bro, I really appreciate you taking the time to spend time with me with this conversation.
I'm so excited to be here, and I just want you to know I love you, brother. I appreciate your humbleness and your eager and your desire and your intentionality in trying to get closer to this topic. So. And dealing with it. So thank you for letting God just move in your heart and in your spirit and throughout the church.
Well, thanks. Well, I just want to kind of jump into this conversation with you. You've, by the state of Texas and by the court, you've been considered or are clarified as a diversity expert. And so I really want to just jump in and understand, why do you think people are really struggling to have a conversation about race or about racism? Why do we shrink back? Why do we struggle with this? I'm just curious your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's one of those topics that has a complex history. If you go all the way back, and we'll talk a little bit more as we have this conversation, but I think the bigger challenge before we get deep into kind of why it's so difficult, it's really getting present to it's real. And I think that I've dealt with it. I remember once when I was a student, I had a good friend of mine who did not do well, forgot he had an exam that he needed to do. Actually, it was a paper. And so he called me and said, Tyron, will you please help me out? Now, what's interesting is I wrote the paper, and I'm a professor.
Right.
Totally inappropriate. But I wrote the paper. It was only 2-3 pages. The assignment was 7 pages. And so the professor gave me a C+, and instead of a higher grade, but he gave my friend, both papers are my papers, right? He gave that paper a B-, right? And so now I shouldn't have been surprised. The class was called the Old South.
This is in South Carolina.
Yes, this is in South Carolina. And so he said, when I went back to him, I said, hey, can you revisit this grade, revisit the scoring? He said, well, maybe I did grade it a little harsh. And he moved it from a
C- to a...
Yeah, up 1/2, but it was still below my... And he actually said to me, when I went back and I dropped the paper off, I said, what made you grade this paper harsh in the first place and this paper so lenient? And of course, the guy that I wrote the paper, well, he's a white guy. We played basketball together. Of course, I was the shooting guard. He was the point guard. So I needed to make sure I helped him out so I could get my points. But here's what I would say to everyone. Try it on. Just get present to what you know. It's real. There's a lot of people that are out there that are sharing. The data is out there. But just be present. Allow yourself to stretch. I remember I told Bob this a while back when we first met. Do you remember when I told you that I used to walk into the gym and I used to just take off from the dotted line? And that's how I remember that conversation. Right? But then as I've gotten more mature, Bob and I, we're the same age.
Yeah, you're quite a bit older. You're about 4 months older than I am. Yeah.
So anyway, I remember now when I go into the gym, if I touch my toes, I've got to touch my toes, and all of this starts popping and cracking. But if I stay down there long enough, healing begins to take place. Blood begins to flow to these old bad joints. And so I would challenge everyone to just be present. Try it on. You know what you know. It's kind of like window shopping. If you don't try it on, you don't know if it's highlighting the right places or hiding the right places. So try it on. You don't have to buy it, but hear what we're saying. It's a real conversation. There's some stats out there that I'll talk about as Bob and I go through this that are just real. 1 in 3 African Americans born in 2001 will likely spend some time in prison. That's huge in comparison to some of our other groups. So I just think it's important to try it on, and we'll get deeper into what that and where that came from.
Yeah, and I think the thing that I've been most startled by is just like I had no idea. And I feel like I'm not, like, even in our small group, or as we were talking about it last Sunday night, or as I've talked with people over the years, just some people have just like, I just didn't have a whole lot of black people that I grew up around, or
Right.
Latinos or Hispanic, just whatever. It's like I just didn't have that many, so I really don't. But like for me, I felt like that wasn't necessarily the case. Like I felt like, and I'm still, I've been shocked how much I've just been unaware of. And so I think because of that, then there's bents and biases that probably, lean me in a certain direction. And so I'm just kind of, I guess for you, what would you say, what truly do you feel like we need to do in order to better understand racism? And because you even would tell me that prejudice and
Right.
racism is different.
Right.
And so help us understand that.
So let me just start with this, because I'm going to get deep into. I want to know before we jump into kind of how we got here. Let me ask you a question. What was it that prompted you to just really want to have this conversation, to try this on? What was it that pushed you to stretch?
Yeah. I don't stretch, by the way. That's part of the problem. I've had so many surgeries. But I mentioned it last week. When I saw Derek and our team, and then a number of other people in our church that were just like crying and weeping and agonizing over the latest events. And like I said, I've seen, this isn't a new conversation, right?
Right.
And so it's kind of like, why? Like I'm angry, I'm disgusted by these things, but I'm not weeping. And so it really, I went home and I prayed, like, God, would you really break my heart? If I'm called to weep with those who weep, then I've got to have better understanding so that I can try to, as best as I'm able to try to get in their shoes so I can provide comfort, care, love, all those things that I'm called to as a follower of Jesus. And so I just didn't get it. And so I asked God to start breaking my heart. And there was this process, but it didn't start breaking my heart just because I prayed a prayer. It was asking questions, calling you, reading numerous things. One book that's been so helpful, Dr. Tony Evans wrote a book, and I have just the utmost respect for him as a pastor, as a theologian. And he wrote a book called Embracing Oneness. In fact, I bought a bunch of copies for our staff. We're going to start going through it as our staff because I really want us to be collectively learning together. Logged a lot of hours with you just saying, man, just help me. And you've given me the grace and you've been incredibly patient to let me kind of press in and ask anything. You're like, you're not going to offend me, say it, whatever, you know. But I think giving me that kind of opportunity and opening that door and being willing to be patient with my own ignorance versus annoyed or irritated allows me to stay in the conversation with you. And so I think that that's been a big part, is that there was a disconnect, and I knew I needed to start having better understanding. So that's kind of what started me on this journey.
And so what you really just said in a nutshell was that you had to seek to understand before being understood. You had to have an intentional, your action required you to take steps because your heart was moved in such a way. And so I think that what has happened in our country is that a lot of movements are birthed out of the hurt and the pain of that, and that pain being ignored and dismissed. Think about the Me Too movement. That wasn't the first time that women have talked about sexism and the struggles that they're going through. But I think we have to be intentional as men, right?
Yep.
We have to be intentional in trying to be present because we're not females, right? And you're not an African-American male, so you haven't had the experiences that a black male would have. And so it took you being intentional. But really what it required was a sense of belief that what is being said is true. And once you got to that place, you were able to put yourself in a space where you could at least try on. So absolutely, I think that's a big part of the steps forward. We've got to develop the empathy and understanding of, and be intentional in trying to get that understanding. As you pointed out, reading the material, talking to people like myself and others.
So why do you feel like, whether it's me or, I don't know, why do you feel like we're just hearing about it? Like, why all of a sudden is this kind of coming? Because this isn't new.
Right.
I don't know. So I guess I'm just at, why do you feel like it's now, with all the education, with all the things, how do we find ourselves in this space now?
Yeah, I think that the journey and that we've gone through and getting here is long. But before I get there, I really want to talk and show you how it plays out in today's society. I asked the guys, I gave them a couple clips, and I want them to play these clips, and then I'm going to have some dialogue, and then I'm going to go back and show how what we saw in these clips played out through a period of time. So how our reality was formed. But what I want to start with is these clips, because we need to see what's happening in the present, and just understand how the mind looks for the evidence to support its view. Can I get you to play
Let's watch this first video.
But the police are not coming, and these teenage vandals are not going to jail. They're actors. The car and the hidden cameras belong to us. We wanted to know if anyone would step in and try to stop a blatant act of vandalism in a suburban parking lot. But as you'll see, before our experiment is over, we'll get a lesson in human nature we could never have predicted. Our teenage vandals are loud and pretty brazen in broad daylight, yet people continue to walk right by. Do they think the boys are trashing their own car? Well, even when it becomes clear the car is not the boys, many keep right on going.
I hope that's your car.
Yeah, I'm spray painting my own car.
You being sarcastic? Yeah.
This woman seems to be almost joking with the boys. Almost.
Don't do mine, please. I can't see. Please, don't do mine.
I promise I won't do yours.
The women keep on walking. Later, they told us they would have called the police. And how about this woman? Will she step up? She looks concerned. She's soon joined by another woman. They stop, speak, but keep going.
What did you notice about that video, Bob?
I would just say that, so for me, I'm seeing that people didn't think anything of, they didn't think it was a big enough deal to call primarily because they were white.
I didn't tell you that. I didn't say that. Okay, very good. These are actors, by the way, Bob. These are not people that are really vandalizing. This is an experiment.
Yeah.
So they were white actors, and several people called.
The kids on the car were actors, but the other people were not actors.
Correct. The people walking by were real people in the neighborhood, and they were trying to get a feel for how people would respond. Now, did you note how even in the midst of the car being vandalized, there was one parent or one person that was actually walking by and joking with the kid.
Right.
It's like, yeah, don't do mine.
Right.
Did you pick up any kind of sense of threat there?
No. She seemed pretty comfortable to engage and ask, be sarcastic, if you will.
Okay, I have a second video. And now during this same period of time, there was a call made to the cops. And I want the guys to, if they would play the second video for me.
Okay.
One 911 call. But it turns out 2 other calls were made to 911 from the same park.
911, where's the emergency?
In Richmond, New Jersey.
But those calls were about another car parked nearby.
A couple guys in the car laying down like they look like possibly they're getting ready to rob somebody.
Rob somebody? How does he know that? The caller hangs up, but a few moments later, he's back.
We got 3 black kids laying in the car, and there's a lot of little kids that's going around. I'm just keeping an eye on them.
In fact, the young people in the car are just sleeping. They also just happen to be black.
Whether it's because of the media, because of history, we as Americans have an association of blacks with crime. Both blacks and whites have that association of blacks with crime.
It doesn't make sense. You call the cops on sleeping kids and not the vandals.
There's nothing rational. But if we have the associations of blacks with crime, we see what we expect. And even if they're sleeping, we can make that into a potential criminal act.
If that had been white kids sleeping,
then they'd be white kids sleeping.
Now, I want to point out, Bob, that the people in the first video were walking by. Those weren't bad people. Those weren't, people burning crosses in the yard or anything like that.
Right.
These are just people. And so we've got this subconscious that drives our views, and the mind looks for the evidence to support our views. And so what I want you to become more and more present to is how our views are created as well as the outcome. So part of our dialogue is deconstructing how deficit model thinking has permeated throughout all of our systems and plays out almost unbeknown in many cases without us even being aware. So I have one last video, and these actors are actually black actors that are vandalizing the car. And
so I just want to, before we go to that, so that the last 2 videos you have in the same area,
right?
You have a bunch of white kids vandalizing a car.
You got it.
That don't get a single call, but then you have 2 black kids sleeping in a car, not doing anything wrong, and they get the phone calls.
Right. There was one call about the vandal, just to be
call.
clear.
Yeah.
But that's the guy called back. There were more than one call with the guys sleeping. But the idea was to get present to this idea of seeing black and brown people through this deficit lens. And there's a reason for that. That didn't just happen.
Right. And that's what I want to get to. So let's go ahead and watch this video.
Let's get to the third video.
As she walks by the vandals, this woman is already on her cell phone.
Yeah, I'm at the Ridgewood Vet Fund, and by the walking path, there's a group of 1, 2, 3 kids.
And right on her heels, this man, cell phone in hand.
911, where's your emergency?
Yeah, hi. I'm over in Ridgewood at the South River Park, Ridgewood Avenue.
Okay, people spray painting a car?
Yeah.
All right, we got it ready. We'll send it off.
This woman asks the boys what they're up to.
Yo, no, we ain't doing nothing, man. Just having fun, man.
While maintaining a safe distance, she also calls 911.
And there's kids that are beating up on a car. How many kids? 3 kids. Black or white. They all 3 look like they're just black.
The destruction continues, and it's clear that in this predominantly white suburb, our 3 African-American vandals are generating more interventions and more calls to 911 than the white vandals. What difference did it make when we changed the vandals' race? A total of 10 calls to 911 compared to 1 call when the vandals were white. And more people stepped in.
They probably recognize that there's vandalism going on more because these kids are black, because of the associations, the expectations, the stereotypes they have, and the fact that these kids are from a different neighborhood.
Okay, so you picked up that 10 calls were made.
Yeah.
Now, I want to put this in perspective. So,
And real quick, I want you to finish, but I think this is important to say because I really want people to understand that this isn't an accusation against every single person, because a lot of times in these moments people get defensive, go, well, I wouldn't do that. I don't. Put that again, seek
Right.
to understand. And so I want to remind us that that's got to be the posture of our heart, not defensiveness. And so please keep going.
Well, so 95% of our behavior is controlled by our subconscious. So it's really, we have to understand that it's like getting a new car, right? Have you ever gotten a new car, Bob?
Yes, my wife's got more new cars than I have, but yes.
So what kind of car did you get?
A while back, it was a Toyota Corolla.
All right, you're in Texas. We're going to get you an F-150. Yes. So think about it like this, all right? So you have this new car. If you were to call, and we're going to speak those things as though they were,
Yeah.
and talk to Ford about your F-150, you might ask the question, because I think this is really powerful when you think about it. Have you ever noticed when you get your new car, all of a sudden you start seeing your new car everywhere you go?
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you were to call Ford and say, listen, I'm seeing my F-150. Now, this is Texas. There are actually a lot of F-150s here. But if you were to say,
Yeah.
listen, why am I seeing my car everywhere I go? Was there a rebate, a sale? Did I miss it? They would say, no. The same number of cars were on the road the week prior to you purchasing your vehicle as they are now. The only thing happened was your mind began to look for the evidence to support your view. And just as the mind will look for the evidence to support your view, it will also overlook the evidence that dispels your view. So what we're going to deconstruct is, where do our views come from?
Yeah.
How do our views begin to push what we see? And that's where I think a part of this conversation, it will go. I will tell you this. One time I was personnel director. This was way back in the day, where if you could walk, talk, chew bubblegum, we had a teaching position for you. Not the same situation now, but I was in North Dakota, and this guy, I was just selling it. We've got the Rockets, the Astros, the Texans, and I'm working it. And I'm saying, I need you to come here. It's full of diversity. You're going to meet people from different races, different ethnicities. And the guy was like, I've never seen a black person in real life. I was like, oh, forget that. You'll meet plenty here. and so he comes down, right, to the city, to Houston. We give him a contract. And so the day that he comes to complete his paperwork, he leaves his window open with his wallet on the seat. So you obviously know he's not from Houston, right? So anyway, he goes back out there to get his wallet because I need his driver's license and to finalize his paperwork. And he says, somebody stole my wallet. And so I said, oh, wow. Did you see anybody? He said, those people did it. I said, which people? He pointed at these two black guys that were in the parking lot. So I go back into the camera, try to see if I can see what happened. And I asked him, did you see those guys go in your car? I mean, did you see it? And he said, no, black people steal. And so then I remember, because I connected the dots, I remember him being the guy that told me that he hadn't had any encounters with African Americans. His community did not have any African Americans. And so he said, I said, well, where did that come from? Where were you? I reminded him what he said. He says, well, I watch the news. Black people steal. So I think it's important to understand that our mind is looking for the evidence, kind of like that new car, and we have views, and our encounters will reinforce those views or dispel those views. But there's a greater uphill battle when those views have been already created, and there's a lot of symbols and pieces of history and things that have gone into creating the evidence of what we see.
Yeah, and that's so true, because when you bring that up, I mean, I think about, and I've said this, my wife just recently got a new car, and so I think about, man, I see them everywhere, right? And so there's so much truth, even when we think about, remove it from this conversation in other realms, that it's just so true that there's so many things, whether it comes from myths, stereotypes, different things. And I just curious, you had mentioned to me that there's a difference between prejudice and racism. And I think it's really important, because I think some of the stuff that you had shared with me about that I thought was really helpful, because we can have prejudice about people that are overweight. We can have prejudice about people that different color. We can have preferences over certain, but that's not racism. Can you just, real briefly, can you just explain that?
Well, first of all, race is a social construct created to facilitate racism.
Yeah.
So racism is the unequal treatment. So think of it just, I've got a narrow window. We could talk like 2 weeks on some of these topics and just scratch the surface. But in a nutshell, it's unequal treatment. And so racism provided the backbone for all types of laws that, I'm talking about laws that have impacted individuals today, that are, when you look at redlining, that's 1977 that ended. Basically, that law was a piece of legislation that said that how you determine if a person is eligible to receive a loan for business or property was based on, are you ready for the criteria? To get an A, no black families in that community. And if you had black families, and it was a scale, right? A D. And so, which meant no funding. So there's an impact as it relates to the transference of wealth and some of the other pieces that impact education. So I think it's important to understand how racism plays even in the subconscious, because these are systematic pieces right now that kind of go together that create a particular outcome.
So how did we get here, right? I mean, how did this, because, I mean, I've got so many questions that we don't have time to answer today, but this is why it's a conversation, because this continues even off. As soon as the cameras are done, we'll continue. But, where did this come from? How did we get here?
Well, so as you think about it, slavery was really your children, your children's children. So it became a mechanism for wealth and profit. And so the justification of that, and you had the indentured servants, but that was 4 to 6 years. Slavery had a different economic opportunity for whites at the time. And so if you think back, the history is always written from the perspective of the victors, right? And so history was written through the lens of whiteness. And you read the Battle of the Alamo, it looks very different than in a Mexican history book than it does an American history book. But African Americans have always been present, always been a part of the history. But if you're trying to marginalize a group of people, you don't build their history because you're trying to create this separation, this group that we're saying is superior. So, the White House is named the most powerful house in the United States. It's called the White House. You start going, if you go back through the history of black and brown people. I gave the guys a picture that I want them to pull up of George Washington and a Moor. Can you guys pull that up?
Nope, that'd be not George Washington.
There you go.
There you go.
And if you see that gentleman in there, the Moors have been part of our history at the very beginning. And so that history has been left out. It's been removed. It has not been a part of our discussion, right? Yeah. And it was really meant to we're not going to talk about your greatness and what you've contributed if we're trying to create you being less than human. And so it was greed, it was economics. And so you had a series of policies from slavery, Jim Crow. I've talked to you a little bit about the poll tax and all of these different laws. When you look all throughout this history, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1890, what was happening there is separate but equal. It was never equal, and it was really whites didn't want to go to school and didn't want to connect with blacks, right? 1954, you have this Brown versus Board of Education where we say, you know what, we're going to undo that. And so what happens there is this idea of we're going to desegregate. But in some places, that didn't happen to the 70s, 80s. So think about, there's been an intentional, with laws and policies, all coming back and justified through a lot of symbols. You leave out the history, and so people of today began to look for the evidence to support a view. What is that view? Well, African Americans are less than human. They're all the myths that are out there. They're superpower, super strength. They've got no pain. That they can. It goes on. And so what's happened over time is that these symbols and these representations, unbeknown, are now part of a system that impacts what we see. So just like the cops or teachers, we see this in education too. They see a black and brown child and the expectations are lower. We did a study. We realized that the mind is so powerful. One time we gave special ed children to a GT teacher, didn't tell them that they were special ed, and we saw the grade levels went up 2 grade levels. And then we turned around and gave the GT students the special ed, and it went down. So we understand, as a man thinketh, and how the mind will look for the evidence to support our views. And so that history has been left out.
Yeah.
The contributions have been left out. The story is incomplete, and there's been this sense of whiteness that has been created. I've shared with you, I've done research in over more than 20 different countries, and I sometimes stop into various churches, and every time I go to a church, I see this picture of Jesus. Can you guys pull up that picture?
The one that we thought was George Washington. There we go.
All right. Now, that's the picture I typically see, or something similar, right? Have you seen that picture before?
I have, yeah.
It's not the first time?
It's not.
You sure?
Pretty confident.
You positive?
Yeah.
All right. Now, if you were to read for me, read Revelations.
Yep. I know where you're going.
You know where I'm going? Where am I going? Let me see.
Revelation 1:14 and 15.
Can you read that for me?
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to put it up here on the screen or not. It says, the hair of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. I'm going to just read verse 15. His feet were like burnished bronze refined in a furnace, and his voice was like a roar of many waters.
Hair like snow, feet like bronze. Can you go back to that picture for me? I want to see if I see the bronze.
Yeah, not so much.
Yeah, okay. I have another picture of bronze. I just typed in bronze. Can you, and you see that picture? That's bronze right there, right? Now, yes, Jesus died for us, and this doesn't, in the context of Jesus and what he came and what he did for us as a human people. But this is what he described. Now, somebody right now, Bob, is getting ready to send you an email saying that it was his feet, not his head. Now, I want to show you a picture based on Scripture, not Tyrone, not Bob, what this person, hair like wool, feet like bronze, might look like. Can you put up that other picture? Could look like that. Mm-hmm. Pull up the picture of sheep. I put you see that? You see that hair? Now go back to that other picture. Go back to bronze for me. Go back to the sheep. And go back to the man. Now, we've never seen a picture typically like that, right? And so it becomes important to understand how these symbols are creating and how that history, some of the oldest fossils in the world, the oldest fossils in the world, bar none.
Yep.
So it doesn't matter if we're in creation or evolution. Most likely, based on what we've heard, the Garden of Eden is probably somewhere in the continent of Africa.
Right. And I would just say, even going back to the picture of the man, and what I would say most of the time, I think the idea. So I reflected on just thinking, do I naturally think of most of these characters in the Old Testament and so forth as white? And that's because I just tell you, all the most of the time, little characters that they put up on the flannel graph. Remember back in the day, they'd have flannel graph for Sunday school?
Right.
It would probably lean in that direction. But as I've studied just Jesus's lineage, and as you study Moses and his sister Miriam and his brother Aaron, and you just go down Ephraim, and you see all the Manasseh and all these different ones, they're black.
Right.
Jesus's lineage is full of black. And so for us to not come to grips with this and to realize there is great, awesome heritage biblically. So again, taking out the old, putting in the new. If we're going to have different behavior, we got to change our belief system.
That's right.
And again, I think it's just important for us to understand, as you were saying, there's just been this unequal power, this unequal understanding towards one another. I think of the just different things in history that I had no idea that I'm realizing as I'm reading. It's factual data. It's not emotional. This is data driven, and so I know that we're limited on time, but and this has been really helpful, and I wish we had a ton more time to be able to talk through this.
You didn't even. I'm a professor.
I'm a preacher, so
okay, so you get that. All right.
Right. So moving forward in this conversation, how do we how do we do this? Because I think this is so important, but how do we move forward trying to have these conversations with one another? Because I know people are already starting to have these conversations, which is awesome. I'm super proud of our church. And I want it to continue, just as this is not just a couple week thing we're going to talk about and then just go back to that. Like, that's not happening. So, and we've got to figure out, so what all does that mean and look like? And that's what we're going to be bringing you in to talk to our staff about diversity. We're going to be walking through stuff. We're going to start doing some things a little differently as a church, just to be able to really honor and be inclusive with our brothers and sisters of color as well. So my question is, how do we continue to move forward having these conversations?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize what has been going on, because there are a lot of people who are saying, they've got this color blindness, right? Which is, if we just stop talking about the race, it'll go away, or I don't see race. I think the importance is to really read some of the material that I'm going to share with you, become present, allow yourself the space to grow in these areas, be intentional, kind of like you have, understand culture is different than race. A lot of my white friends, the guys were like, what do you mean privilege? I grew up poor and I had to work hard, single parent. But understanding when people say that, the condition of poverty is a condition that is different than race, or when they say white privilege, it's not saying that you just had this easy walk, but your whiteness did not get in the way. Yep. Whiteness did not impact you with redlining and some of the policies that follow.
And that piece was huge for me, because I would probably say there was parts of when I would hear, oh, you're just white privilege or whatever, it would like I wanted to just really get in your face about it. Not you, but like when it would get brought up, because I'm like, you have no idea. I didn't have some, gold
silver spoon
in my mouth. I didn't have, I had to fight for everything I got. And so for you to say, it really bothered me.
I got it.
Until I had a better understanding of where that comes from, and understanding that because there are certain privileges throughout history that we have been given, that if you were black or of color, you just didn't get. In fact, it would be the opposite. It would make it even harder. Like
you could have been poor as dirt, gone to Goodwill, got you a suit, put that suit on, shaved, got cleaned up, and some people would have looked at you and said, you belong, whereas the African American experience has been, we've got to prove that we belong. Yeah. And so I think that's an important distinction, because it is very true that condition of poverty doesn't mean that you didn't have challenges. It just means that it wasn't driven by race. We've got to come together. If we're going to be one nation under God, we have got to have the empathy, begin to come together as one. And I'm very excited about this time. We've never seen this volume of people from all backgrounds be a part of this journey. As such, I really think if we come together, we can really create something special. This is the time.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Doc, it has been my privilege to have you, man. I really, really appreciate it. He's gonna give me some resources, and so we're gonna try to get those posted and provide some opportunities to be able to learn some more. We're gonna continue to have more conversation about it, but I just want you to know, not only from me, but from our team, our leadership here at SciLife, it's a joy to have you as a part of the family at SciLife. But it really means a lot that you have continued to walk alongside with me, continue to challenge my thinking so that my behavior can match up to the identity that Jesus has called us to.
Amen, amen.
So, brother, I appreciate you.
Love you, brother.
All right, let me pray for us. Lord, thank you so much. This conversation can be incredibly hard, because we're stepping in. I'll just speak for me. Stepping into areas, trying to lead through areas, trying to understand in things that I've just not been aware of. And so, God, I can't plead naivety or ignorance any longer. It's this thing that you've called us to as followers of you, that we're called to continue. If we're going to love and live like Jesus, then that means the people that we work with, the people that we're neighbors with, the people that we go to church with, people that are different than us. And God, that would we be agents of change, and that would we really learn how to love. But it starts with a heart posture of seeking to really understand. And it's okay to wrestle and to grapple with all of these different things. Some of this stuff can feel like, I know for me, I have felt massively overwhelmed. Just all the information, all the stuff, trying to process what's true and just even in my own life, just what have I bought into that maybe was a myth? But God, would we respond as your children with a heart attitude that would cling to your scriptures, that continue to call me to not partiality, to not prejudice, but to love. And to come alongside of our brothers and sisters and fight for them against injustice. Because, Lord, the way you see us is through the lens of the cross, where we're all on even ground. And Lord, that would be the case for us. Lord, thank you for this conversation. May it continue and may it grow us together and more unified. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hate's been marching in the streets, division like I've never seen. Most days I don't know what to do, nowhere to turn, I turn to you. There's different colors on our skin, but we bleed the same when anger wins. There's walls that time can't seem to break, but I know there's power in your name. Oh, Jesus, come, thy will be done. Draw us near, we need you here in America. So let revival come alive, heaven fall on stars and stripes, heal our hearts and heal our land. You're the only one who can. Oh, Jesus, come, thy will be done. And calm our fears, we need you here in America. If you hold the world inside your head, if the lion lays down with the lamb, oh, I know it's dark today, but still I see that shining city on a hill. Oh, Jesus, come, thy will be done. Draw us near, we need you here. Jesus, come, thy will be done. Calm our fears, we need you here in America. When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see, I won't cry, I won't cry. No, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand by me. Darling, darling, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand, Lord, won't you stand by me.
So that's what we're asking of you. That we're called to stand beside one another, linking arms in prayer and also seeking the Lord and also seeking to understand one another. It's learning to take off that old thinking and replace it with new, that our minds would be renewed so that our belief really drives the behavior that aligns with Jesus. Well, listen, I'm so grateful that you've chosen to sit in and listen to this conversation. I hope that you'll even start some of your own conversations. But we're going to continue. Next week, we're going to celebrate Father's Day. We're going to have a number of the dads here that we're going to have some conversation as well, just being able to connect as fathers and just celebrating dads and celebrating fathers. So we hope that you'll tune in. But before you leave, we were able to take a few shots from yesterday's celebration and fundraiser for the Knox family. And again, church, SciLife, thank you so much for your continued faithfulness in your service and your giving. And we are just blessed to call you family. So you guys have a great day. We look forward to seeing you next week.
We're here at SciLife Church at the Jason Knox fundraiser. It's been an incredible day.
Thank you for your support. We couldn't have done this without you.
Just incredibly grateful for our church just coming out here, not only representing through purchasing food, have had so many people come out and buy in order to bless the Knox family, but just the amount of volunteers that have come out and served so faithfully. We had our cook team here, 11 o'clock Friday night, cooked all night long. So again, SciLife Church, just super proud to be a part of this family with you. And again, thank you so much for being a blessing to the Knox family.